Alrighty, welcome to the ISBH International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics paper series on Bible difficulties related to eschatology. My name is Paul Miles, and I am presenting part 2 of a paper on the intertextuality of the Massacre of the Innocents narrative there in Matthew 2. So last month we went through the introduction and first dozen verses of the chapter. Today we'll pick up and finish. Let's see if I can hit the share screen. Let's see here. All right. So quick review of what we did last time. There's an introduction. We looked at some works that have made some recent contributions to the field of dispensational intertextuality, specifically Stephen Sullivan's dissertation, which deals with the Dodd-Hayes principle of total context, as well as Abner Chau's work, which he develops a hermeneutics of obedience, and Michael Vlach's work that deals with single meaning, multiple significances. In so many words, whenever we come across a intertext within the Bible, we should go back to the original text, understand that the biblical authors held to a single meaning interpretation consistently throughout Scripture. While every passage only has one interpretation that's valid, it may have multiple significances and implications that are valid. We should examine the passage in its original holistic context in which it occurs, which involves sometimes going back to intertext that the intertextual passage is using. And we must maintain a high view of Scripture and be obedient to the text. From there, we took a look at the wise men. How is it that they knew to look for a star, and why did they follow it when they did? We looked at the gifts which they brought, which shows some interesting insight to what the wise men knew about the Messiah. Okay, so we'll pick up in Matthew 12:13, and Lord willing, we'll get to the end of the chapter. So the narrative continues, and I won't read the whole passage here, but the big controversial one is this: out of Egypt I have called my son. The passage is frequently used to defend hermeneutical approaches that see the New Testament authors changing or adding to the meaning of the Old Testament text. But if Matthew was changing or adding a new meaning to Israel's national exodus, then Hosea would seem to be an odd text to use. As Chau points out, if Matthew was just making an arbitrary forced connection with Exodus, why not choose a more obvious text from that book? Citing Exodus 4:22 would have even provided the concepts of sonship and the Exodus. However, if we accept that Hosea was integrating information that came from Numbers, then Matthew's application of Hosea makes sense. I propose that Hosea refers to God calling the individual Messiah from Egypt, and that Matthew maintained this single meaning. Vlach summarizes the view. So Matthew relies on Hosea, who relies on Balaam, and as already seen, Balaam relies on Jacob. We saw that in some of the earlier portions of Matthew 2. So it flows quite naturally into this passage. So returning to Balaam's oracles and Jacob's blessing, both Balaam and Jacob developed the nation of Israel and the individual Messiah. Here I'm using a convention that is convenient in Word, and if anyone has a recommendation for how to do this in black and white, I would appreciate it. But I'm doing boldface blue to mean the nation of Israel, which is evident in the lion imagery, which I single underline. And the individual Messiah, I'm doing boldface red as evidence in the scepter imagery, which, as previously noted, occurs against Balaam, again in Balaam's fourth prophecy, which informed the wise men of the star. In Balaam's broader context, he is being told to curse national Israel, but when he opens his mouth, he blesses national Israel. Balaam's second and third oracles conclude with statements about national Israel that integrate the lion imagery. The third oracle even combines the bowing lion wording from Jacob's blessing with the blessing from the Abrahamic covenant. So Balaam's second and third oracles contain references to Egypt. The second oracle reminds Balak of Israel's national exodus from Egypt, And the third oracle speaks of a future king of Israel who will come from Egypt. So here we have Jacob's blessing. In this column, we have Hosea's text over here. Jacob speaks of Judah being a lion's whelp. And we see the scepter will not depart from Judah. So there's a national reference and an individual Messiah reference. When we get to Balaam's oracles, we see God brings them out of Egypt. This is after the Exodus, so that is a national statement of God's deliverance from Egypt. And look, a people rises like a lioness, using that lion imagery again. Then we go further to Numbers 24, and Balaam is speaking again. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. Is he speaking of an individual here, or is it a nation? This is an individual. So he's speaking of the individual Messiah king. We know he's going to be a king from the scepter imagery over in Genesis. What does he say next? God brings him, singular, out of Egypt. And then we go on with the lion imagery in red. So by the time we get to Hosea, when Israel was a child, I loved him. That's a national statement. And then we have, out of Egypt, I called my son, which aligns very well with previous revelation about the Messiah coming out of Egypt. This is not a new idea that Hosea is coming up with. He already has Balaam. Then we have the lion imagery about the nation later on. Okay. So since the meaning of Hosea picks up the meaning of Balaam, Matthew could write a short tag, out of Egypt I called my son. And his original Jewish audience could connect the dots to Balaam and Jacob. Total context of Hosea 11:1. Hosea 11:1 marks a turning point in the book of Hosea. There's a quote by Feinberg. How appropriate for this turn to God's love to begin with the statement, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt, I called my son. Accepting the view presented here, Hosea is talking about Israel's past as a child, and future, that is coming Messiah, is God's son, who will come out of Egypt. Then there's a opposition from Keener, which is addressed there. Okay, so more to the point. I am challenging here the notion that Hosea refers to God delivering national Israel from Egypt, which he clearly did, but that's not what Hosea is talking about. Hosea made a messianic prophecy, not a historical statement about the Exodus. So Matthew did not diverge from grammatical historicism by treating Hosea as a messianic prophecy. Hosea's use of Balaam's Messiah from Egypt. The total context of Balaam's prophecy includes the Messiah's future exodus from Egypt, which Hosea develops and Matthew quotes. So conveniently, Balaam's prophecy comes into Matthew's intertextuality again. Balaam mentions Egypt twice, once in his second prophecy and once in his third prophecy. The wording is almost identical, but the difference is key. God brings them out of Egypt. God brings him out of Egypt. In both cases, God is being compared to a wild ox for his strength. And in both cases, the hiphil participle of yatzah occurs, which is translated, brings them him, but the sense could be vaguer, as the participle could be more woodenly translated as the bringer of them or him. In the second oracle, God is calling the bringer of them, that is Israel, when he brought them out of Egypt in the past. In the third oracle, God is the bringer of him, which refers to the previous two lines, his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. The second oracle refers to the past delivery of national Israel from Egypt, and the third oracle refers to the future deliverance of the individual King Messiah from Egypt. I'm going to hit a little tag right here because that's not the format that I use later in the paper. I need to go back and reformat that a little bit. So the NKJV can be modified to fit the English tenses. God who brought them out of Egypt and God who shall bring them out of Egypt. In the second oracle, Balaam talks about national Israel and mentions her deliverance from Egypt. The third oracle builds on the second using the same device of comparing God to the ox. In Balaam's total context, he is blessing national Israel before Balak. The Abrahamic covenant is the basis for Israel's blessing, and the coming Messiah is part of the Abrahamic covenant, so it is appropriate to bring the Messiah into the discussion as well as the Abrahamic covenant itself. Conclusion: the individual Messiah will come from Egypt. Balaam said that the Messiah would come from Egypt. Hosea said the Messiah would come from Egypt. Matthew said that the Messiah has already come from Egypt. It turns out that Matthew 2:15 is not actually a proof text against singular, but rather for the contextual singular, meaning multiple implications hermeneutic of obedience. When our brothers who hold the Christocentric hermeneutic try to push the Christological meaning into Matthew 2:15, they are forcing Jesus into a text where he is already present, and they miss Christ in the prophecies of Balaam and Hosea, where he is also present. So it turns out that if you want to read Christ in every scripture, in this case, you got to read it like we do, by not forcing Jesus in. Okay, so intertextuality in Matthew 2:16-18. The narrative continues. Then we have this passage, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Okay, so in this passage, a terrible thing happens in Israel, and Matthew writes that it fulfills what Jeremiah wrote. In short, Jeremiah describes Israel's condition as it will exist until the second coming. The condition is one of constant antagonism against Israel, and anytime Israel goes through national trauma, it aligns with that which Jeremiah described. Interestingly, I found a couple of guys who are totally not dispensationalist, and even they recognize a recurring motif of national trauma throughout this passage. This is not something that you have to have our eschatological lens to see. It's very clear in the text. Anyhow, moving along. Implementation language and continuous trouble. Some points of clarification need to be made about the nature of the verb plereo, which is commonly translated to fulfill. Fulfill verbiage does not always refer to prophecy, and when it does refer to prophecy, it does not necessarily refer to the completion of a foretold event. To be clear, a single prophecy will not be completed more than once. There is a legitimate law of double reference, which correctly says that two events may occur side by side in an Old Testament passage, even if their fulfillment is going to be separate. And there is an illegitimate law of double fulfillment, which incorrectly says that one single prophecy may be completed two times. Notice I'm using the word completed here. Sometimes the prophets foretell long periods. When an event within the period occurs, it does not finish the period, but it does implement an aspect of the period. For example, Jeremiah tells of a time of Jacob's trouble, and John tells of the fourth bowl judgment. But when the fourth bowl comes, it does not complete the time of Jacob's trouble, which is a 7-year period, but is only an implementation of an event from within the tribulation, which will end at a later time as foretold. So it is with Matthew's use of Jeremiah. The time from Jeremiah to the establishment of the Messianic kingdom is a long period, which Israel will suffer, in which Israel will suffer many national traumas. The massacre of the innocents is one such trauma. So it implements Jeremiah's concept without finishing the period. This is what Matthew means with the word fulfill here. That might be a little controversial. If anyone wants to give any pushback, I welcome that in the discussion a bit later here. Okay. So the total context of Jeremiah 31:15. Matthew records the slaughter of children in Bethlehem. So what do Ramah and Rachel have to do with it? Bethlehem is in Judah, and Judah was Leah's son, not Rachel's. There are several cities named Ramah in the Bible, but Jeremiah's context, this is Ramah in Ephraim, who is Joseph's son, who is Rachel's son, not Leah's. Ramah can be traced as a location where Rachel was buried, which was near Bethlehem and on the border between Benjamin and Ephraim. So when Jeremiah metaphorically depicts Rachel as crying, she does so from her grave in Ramah. Rachel's crying is reminiscent of her death when she cried out in great labor. The pangs of childbirth are a recurring motif in Scripture that refer to the tribulations leading up to the Messianic kingdom, as mentioned earlier. 2 Saints sees the Ramah-Bethlehem connection as typological fulfillment. But if the situation is ongoing, then we may go a bit further in saying that the massacre is not so much an antitype, but one instance in a pattern of ongoing national trauma. The northern and southern kingdoms were torn asunder. Ramah would have been the seams where they fell apart. In Jeremiah, God gives words of comfort. Thus says the Lord, refrain your voice from weeping. There is hope in your future, says the Lord, that your children shall come back to their own border. The fulfillment of this return to the borders will ultimately be fulfilled in the Messianic kingdom. Hence the context for the new covenant in the same chapter. So long as Israel is not in the borders, it could be said that Rachel is crying out. This is not the only option for dispensationalists. Mary Chilton Calloway has written on the history of Jeremiah's interpretation, and she summarizes the Jewish perspectives on the passage there. I won't read that whole text aloud there. So Herod would not have gotten away with the murder of Bethlehem's children if Messiah was ruling with an iron scepter. Jeremiah depicts Rachel crying out as Israel is torn apart, and she will continue weeping until Messiah establishes his kingdom. So Matthew took the opportunity to integrate Jeremiah's passage into his narrative. I'm going to put a paragraph break there. Okay. So conclusion. Jeremiah looks forward to the day when the Messianic kingdom comes and the new covenant is enacted. In the meantime, Israel is scattered. Anti-Semitism is the norm during this evil age, and whenever there is attack on Israel, it is as if Rachel cries out from the borderland, because there's still in dispersion. Such was the situation in Matthew 2. The borders were not yet as God laid them out for Abraham. The Messiah was not yet ruling, so Herod could get away with murder. All right, so the intertextuality of Matthew 2:19-23. The narrative concludes with Joseph coming back. They relocate to Nazareth in Galilee, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. The application of what was spoken by the prophets in Matthew 2:23 is difficult, as there is no direct quote given, nor are the prophets named. This is not only problematic for interpreters who hold to the exclusivity of grammatical historical hermeneutics. Even those who hold to a Christocentric hermeneutic must struggle, as there is no direct quote from the Hebrew scriptures given to ascribe a secondary meaning to. Several acceptable explanations have been offered, but the one taken here is that Jesus's Nazarene heritage contributed to the prophecies of him being despised by men. So let's take a look at 3 acceptable common views that you might hear first. Silence, Samson's antitype, or the Messianic branch. One proposition is that Matthew is appealing to something that the prophets said, but that was not recorded in Scripture. This proposal is not entirely without biblical precedent. Jude quoted Enoch's prophecy, which was not recorded in the Bible earlier. Enoch was the 7th from Adam, so the prophecy would have had to survive the travesties of Noah's flood, the apostasy of the divided kingdom, and the Babylonian exile, as well as the intertestamental period. It would not be unreasonable for prophets to have announced that the Messiah would come from Nazareth, and for this message to be known through Matthew's day without being written down in previous revelation. Got that precedent already with Enoch. Now, a problem with this view is that apparently the Jews were not expecting the Messiah to come from Nazareth, as they should have, if multiple prophets had foretold so. We see that in Nathanael's statement there in John 1:46. But then again, there were other basic messianic concepts that first Israelites sometimes mistook. So I don't want to discount that option too harshly. A second proposition is to identify Jesus with Samson. The angel of the Lord said about Samson, the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Samson did not fully deliver Israel in the sense that Messiah eventually will. So it could be said that Messiah will finish that which Samson started. However, this connection does not fit well in Matthew 2:23. The connection relies on equating Nazareos of Matthew 2:23 with reading in the Septuagint A, which has Nazareos for Nazir, Nazarite, in Judges 13:5, 7, and 16:17, while another manuscript has Nazir or even Hagios. The shift from omega to iota could also be problematic, though it seems that Nazarite could have flexible spellings. Linguistic difficulties aside, if Jesus was to be called a Nazarite in the completion of Samson's work, then being born in Nazareth would not suffice. Jesus was a Nazarene, not a Nazarite. The Nazarites were forbidden from drinking wine, but Jesus drank wine and was even slandered for doing so, as I'm sure Baptists are going to slander me for saying that. I joke, I love Baptists, but there's a controversy as to whether or not he actually drank wine. I tend to think that he did. At any rate, he was not a Nazarite. A third proposal is that Nazarene is linked to the Hebrew word for branch. It is possible that the etymology of Nazareth, the city, is related to Netzer, meaning branch. Nazareth does not occur in the Hebrew scriptures, and not much is known about its founding. Perhaps when the town was named, it was known that the messianic branch would come from Nazareth. So perhaps they named the town after that. Alternatively, it is possible that since students of Isaiah knew that the Messiah was called a branch, when Jesus was called a Nazarene, it was seen as a fulfillment of being called a branch. However, the Messiah elsewhere is called a branch using the Hebrew word tzemech, which does not sound like Nazareth. A similar approach is to draw a connection not to branch, but to Nazir, which means separate or holy. You can take the same route with that. So those are three views that are common, and I'm not out to behead anyone that holds to any of those views. Okay. So part B here, another proposal. Any of the previous three proposals could fit on a grammatical historical framework, but a fourth option taken here is that Jesus was despised for being from Nazareth, which is an implementation of the prophecies of the despised Messiah. Many prophets depict the Messiah as lowly and suffering, and the response of Jesus' contemporaries was to stigmatize him for being a Galilean, a Nazarene, no less. Hence, Nathanael's question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Rabbi Yehuda Hanazi was famous for his role as an intermediary between Jews and Romans, very good with diplomacy. And he had a low opinion of Galileans, saying the people of Galilee were quarrelsome. It was said that Galileans' knowledge of Torah was not long-lasting. Apparently, the Galileans had recognizable accents, as they did not pronounce gutturals like others. Here's a quote from the Babylonian Talmud, which is interesting enough. I will read this one. It says that the sons of Judah are precise in their language, the sons of Galilee who are not precise in their language. What is the meaning of this? The Aramaic there is a little awkward. So as I was taught, a son of Galilee who would walk and say to someone, who has an Amar for sale? Who has an Amar for sale? They said to him, stupid Galilean, do you mean a Hamar, a donkey, to ride? Or Hamar, wine to drink? Wool is Amar, to wear, or a lamb, Amar, to slaughter. Of course, I'm sure Galileans could pronounce Aramaic a lot better than even I could, right? But it's interesting that we have a trace in the Babylonian Talmud that that clarifies the accents that the Galileans had. This is beneficial for studies when we get into the New Testament, and Peter and John are recognized for their accents coming from Galilee. This is probably the kind of speech that they used. Okay, that nerdiness aside, Galileans were known as stupid and quarrelsome, so they were looked down upon. Now, Jesus was neither stupid nor quarrelsome, but perhaps people still allowed their low opinions of Galilee to influence their opinion of Jesus of Nazareth. The structure of the sentence is unique. Consider the Greek as it is translated by the New King James Version and the NIV. Difference being that New King James and others have "he shall be called a Nazarene" in quotation mark, while NIV and others have not quotation marks, but say that he would be called a Nazarene. Difference being what we do with hati there. We'll get into that next. So Matthew cites a plurality of prophets instead of an individual, which is not a very common format. And he uses the conjunction hati rather than the participle legontos. France explains why this formula is different. I'll put RT there. All right. I get that? Yes, RT. Okay. The hati clause is often interpreted, as in the New King James Version, as presenting a quote by the prophets. Another possibility is that the hati clause does not introduce what the prophet said, but explains further that it is fulfilled what is said. Mencken explains the two views there. So in his opinion, it should be not a quotation, he will be called, rather for he will be called a Nazarene. The view in this paper is a slight variation of Mencken's interpretation. The prophets did not say he shall be called a Nazarene, but rather that by being called a Nazarene, something that the prophets said was being implemented. The prophets said that the Messiah would be despised by men, and since Nazarenes are despised by men, the Messiah was despised and is still despised for being a Nazarene, in addition to all of the other reasons that he was despised. Matthew uses the future tense for he shall be called a Nazarene, and even today, Jesus is referred to as the Nazarene by his opponents. Throughout rabbinic literature, he is referred to as Yeshua HaNazari. In Arabic-speaking cultures, one of the words for Christians is Nasrani, which comes from Nazarene. The terrorist group ISIS would sometimes write the Arabic letter Nun for Nazarene on Christians' property to mark them for oppression. Jesus' humble Nazarene heritage will likely continue to be invoked negatively by his opponents through the tribulation, but positively by his friends through eternity. All right, conclusion of the paper here. Caesar Augustus is often cited as having said, "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son." Herod was a sadistic murderer. Matthew records his massacre of the innocents, and in doing so, he left a goldmine of intertextual studies for his readers. It is common to hear accusations that Matthew was ignorant of the Old Testament, or that he somehow changed the meaning of the Old Testament. But upon closer examination, he was actually using a plain grammatical, historical, hermeneutical method with the text that he quoted. Some further areas to explore include Hosea's use of Ephraim's child imagery in Hosea 11:3 through 11, as well as his usage of Egypt in the same passage. Are Hosea, Jeremiah, and Balaam having another conversation there? Amos can be read as a companion volume to Hosea. Are there any gleanings in Amos that contribute further to the Old Testament background of the Massacre of the Innocents? Micah uses Jacob's blessing, and Balaam uses Jacob's blessing. But what is more, Micah uses Balaam. Could Micah be contributing more to Matthew 2 than we think? There's never been a better time to be a dispensationalist. There's much more to explore in the field of intertextuality, and excellent discussions are already occurring in academic literature among us. Hopefully, this chapter will contribute positively to the complex topic of intertextuality and the Massacre of the Innocents narrative. Okay, so that was a mouthful. Any questions, comments, accusations of heresy? Oh, Babs, I see you've joined us. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Great one. Thank you so much.
Good to see you here. Babs is my colleague with the Global Missions Institute, which is just starting up this fall. So exciting to be in with him on that.
I enjoy the fact that you're using lordship research.
You know, as opposed to the soteriology of lordship salvation, as I am, I think we who hold to a faith alone and Christ alone approach would be doing ourselves a disservice to ignore their writings entirely. There's some really good stuff that has come out of Master's Seminary on the topic of intertextuality, as well as other stuff such as inerrancy and general conservatism that I think we can all benefit from. So I appreciate a lot of their work on that front.
So, Paul, I really did appreciate the presentation to the point where, again, there was so much in agreement. It's tough to come up with any questions or difficulties, but I would ask, what was the content of the new revelation, if you'll permit the tongue-in-cheek, since Sunday, and where was the change?
Oh, that's good. For those of us, I don't know if this came out on the Facebook or if I had not pushed the button yet. I have changed my opinion since like Sunday as I've studied through that last little passage. He shall be called a Nazarene. I made a switch. I was leaning more toward the first view in the paper that multiple prophets had talked about Jesus coming out of the city of Nazareth, and that it wasn't written down in a way similar to Enoch's prophecy not being written down in inspired literature. A real difficulty with that, like I brought up in the paper, is that apparently first century Jews were not anticipating the Messiah to come out of Nazareth. So that would cast doubt there, though it can be responded that a lot of them had a lot of goofy ideas elsewhere. As I looked closer at this option that it is in reference to Jesus being despised, I saw this as being more feasible. At first, I kind of brushed away the ones that look like they're doing a play on Hebrew words on the grounds that that doesn't seem to be taking the words for their grammatical historical sense. However, if really this view is kind of in the middle, right? It's not saying that there is a passage where a word similar to Nazarene was used, and so Jesus is fulfilling that passage and completing it here. But rather, if we accept Nazarene as being despised, we can support through plenty of extra biblical literature that his contemporaries despised his Nazarene heritage. We see some rather slights on calling people Nazarenes throughout the text in the Bible itself. And then we see the future tense, which continues on to this day, of Jesus being referred to as Nazarene. Like I mentioned, that's even the identifier for Christians who are under oppression today. So I saw that as perhaps being fulfilling a plurality of passages that deal with his oppression. Fulfilling, I need to clarify, being, as presented early in the paper, that it does not necessarily mean the completion of something, but rather the implementation of something. So,
which is so important.
Yeah. It's got a couple of pieces, right? I'm not saying that by being born in Nazareth, he completed that which was said. It is just an implementation. This is just another strike against Jesus. We can't like him because he's from Nazareth. In addition to he's claiming to be God, he's claiming to be the Messiah. What's more, he doesn't pronounce his gutturals like we do.
Well, and the other thing about that interpretation that I find, it seems that is the only sense in which Matthew would be compelled to use it, because his entire book is essentially an explanation of how Jesus Christ presented himself as the Messiah, but was rejected and despised, right? So, I mean, again, not to suggest that the macro context of the book has to dictate the understanding of every single word in prophecy. It's really the only one that addresses Matthew's theme and makes sense for him to bring up in terms of the 3 or 4 legitimate interpretations. So I just really appreciated your thoughts on that. Thank you for sharing that.
I appreciate it. The Matthew context as a whole is another good point, by the way. And it fits well, right? If we follow the narrative, of course, chronologically, the moving to Nazareth occurs last, but throughout the passage, we're seeing this tension. This group, the wise men are accepting and they're seeking him. Herod is trying to wipe him out. Right, Rachel is crying out. The Israel is going through this hard time, and then so we've got this complex mixture of emotions going on. And how does it all end? With, well, he is despised and rejected, and being a Nazarene on top of that contributes to it. Which is kind of Matthew's style, right? The triumphal entry is kind of like that, right? We've got the Messiah riding in on the colt of a donkey, right? And it's exciting. People are shouting, Hosanna, it's a fulfillment of prophecy. And there's this little cohort, and it gets in, and then it's anticlimactic. How does that end? People say, who is that? They don't even get it, right? So it's kind of parallel with that. I wonder if there's a chiastic structure that can be drawn with those 2 particular ones in particular. I'd have to look at that one.
Matthew himself, right, is a living example of that, as a tax collector and, as a sinner, someone who had been so opposed to and so rejected by, to be the one whom God selected to write the gospel to the Jews, shows that he himself is sort of a living example of that. Obviously is the society that he would have been at least somewhat separated from, if not entirely separated from, by his profession at a minimum, and who knows what other implications of that, for him to be the one to come from without and say, you would have despised me as well, but here I am, doing this work to make known to you your Messiah.
It's a beautiful perspective. It's almost as if God himself chose Matthew individually to write this.
Almost as if.
Almost as if.
Could it work that way?
Right? The Bible looks exactly like you would expect it to look like if it is what it claims to be. It's beautiful. I love it.
So true.
Paul, would you comment again on the difference between fulfillment and implementation from plerao?
Okay. Good question. So fulfillment is a fine word. A problem is that it's got some loaded connotations that are not necessarily accurate every time. When we say fulfillment in English, we are often thinking of completion. Implementation is a word that I prefer, and I'm open to synonyms, by the way, because implementation does not necessarily mean that something has been finished and is no more, but rather that a prophet can be describing something that takes place over a long period of time. and that things occur within that period of time that are consistent with that period of time, such that these occurrences are implementations. They keep happening, but they do not finish that which is being said. I'm not saying that there is a double fulfillment, which would imply a prophecy having a completion and then a secondary meaning that is also being completed. That I think could be dangerous hermeneutically speaking. But if God says that something is going to happen on multiple occasions, then the multiple occasions could be seen as implementations rather than finishing. Does that kind of make sense?
Instantiations of the pattern.
Okay, instantiations of the pattern. Pattern's a good word, right?
Well, and I think it's a really important distinction, because I just taught through Matthew over the last few years, and it's a really important distinction, because when the Western mind, the modern Western mind, hears the idea of fulfillment, they're looking for, God said this was going to happen, and then it happened. And when it doesn't work out like that, I think Fruchtenbaum's, rules of the way that the Old Testament is used by the New is a good kind of indication of this kind of thinking. And Chow is similarly encourages us, I think. And I think it's wise. I mean, recognizing that it's not always a prophecy fulfillment, but oftentimes hey, this is the way God does stuff, with the flow. This is a godlike thing to do. It's in the fullness of what has come before.
So that which was true during the Massacre of the Innocents, the imagery of Rachel crying out, right? The reason that the Massacre of the Innocents occurred is because the Messianic kingdom has not been established, and anti-Semitism is the way things are going right now. That occurred in the Holocaust as well, right? Israel is still scattered all over the place. We have this evil act of anti-Semitism. Did Rachel stop crying out? Did she say, well, it's been fulfilled at the Massacre of the Innocents, so there's no more anti-Semitism happening? No, it continues to this day. It's going to happen all the way through the tribulation. So the Holocaust was an implementation of anti-Semitism of this wicked age that we're in, as was the Massacre of the Innocents and many other atrocities. Does that kind of make sense, Jim? Would you modify that, or?
No, I think that's going to satisfy the requirements here for interpreting that passage. It's interesting that if you go back to Jeremiah, I mean, what he's watching is the deportation of his people to Babylon.
Yep. And why is the deportation happening? It's the beginning of the tearing apart of the borders and the sending people out into exile. And a lot of these returned from all 12 tribes. There's no 10 lost tribes, as some people say, but not everybody did return. And they're still in diaspora today. And some are returning today. People are making Aliyah regularly, but they're still in diaspora. We're still facing anti-Semitism. So the situation that began with Jeremiah, when he saw the deportations taking place, has yet to reach its conclusion. But it will finish, it will be completed when the Messiah comes.
Just out of curiosity, while we're on the Pleyrehu subject, considering where you are, have you had a chance to interact with Dr. Fruchtenbaum on this paper yet?
So I reading his Yeshua commentary, which I happen to have a copy of on the shelf, being as how I'm at Shoshana, was helpful to urging me into this this perspective. That would be the same one that Fruchtenbaum and several others are part of. The oddity that I'm kind of bringing in that I haven't seen fully developed would be, what do we do with the Hati conjunction?
Yeah, that's new information to me. Yeah.
I could be wrong, and I welcome correction there. What I'm seeing is that a lot of people are recognizing that something different is happening in the Greek here. I mentioned two authors that talked about it in the paper that I've come across, a couple of others in the scholastic literature. Nobody is going quite in the same direction that I am there, among those whom I've read, but I think it could work. I don't see a grammatical reason. Maybe someone with more Greek prowess than I could point out why it wouldn't work. But if instead of hoti being used to introduce a quotation mark, if it's used to say, for he shall be called a Nazarene, that would align with several interpreters, several translators, a large community of translators. The application, though, of saying that there's not, that there were prophets saying that he would be a Nazarene in their own words, but rather that him being called a Nazarene fulfills something else that the prophets were talking about him being despised. I think that would jive. Oops. Oh no. Bye, Dan. Oh, he's already gone. Okay.
If there's no further questions, I'd sure love to hear how things are going at Shoshone.
Oh, they're great. So for those of who have just jumped on the Facebook or the YouTube, my family and I are currently at Ariel School of Messianic Studies, Shoshana campus, which is a camp in upstate New York, and we're having a blast. They've got a good children's program for our son to take part in, and we've got lectures for the adults. Let's see, this week we've got Montel Belliston talking about the history and theology of the Holocaust. It's important. The Holocaust is a theological issue, and it needs to be addressed theologically, and Model is knocking it out of the park. He's doing a great job. Arnold Fruchtenbaum is talking about the book of Daniel, which he has just published a commentary on. I got a copy of the commentary. I'm looking forward to digging in later. So he's doing highlights from Daniel and highlights from the life of the Messiah, which is another topic that he's one of the leading scholars on. He's really done some good work with that. Then in the evening, we're having lessons on the book of Hebrews with Arnold Fruchtenbaum, another topic he's great with. And rabbinic interpretations of messianic prophecy is another class that we're having, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself. So I highly recommend it. Different weeks have different programs, but that's what we're in the middle of. So
I wasn't able to attend before. Do you have the link? Can you provide the link to the prior session?
to the session or the paper?
Oh, is the paper different from the one you just shared?
The one I just shared is the edited version of the one that I presented last time. You can see the presentation of the paper on our Facebook page, ISBH presentations. Just scroll down a little
I'll
bit
look
from
for
this
that.
one.
Thanks.
Or you can see it on YouTube as well. So,
Any
YouTube is
updates
where we
on
have our other presentations as well. We'll be having a webinar this weekend on intertextuality. So more of this stuff.
awesome? Any updates on the Miles family and your direction in the next months and years? Are you
Oh
going
goodness. Let's
back
see.
to Europe
So
anytime soon? Or?
we for those who aren't in the loop, we came to America for 6 months. We typically live in Ukraine. We came to America for 6 months on August 31st, 2021 with a return ticket for February 14th, 2022. But the return flights were all canceled. So we've extended our stay here. We are on the road a lot. We are in Northwest Arkansas for the summer. And currently we're taking a road trip. We were in Cedarville last week for the International Conference on Creationism. big conference where theologians and scientists get together and talk about the biblical creationism from a Young's creationist science perspective. Good stuff. Now we're in Susana for the week, and then from here we're going to be moseying back to Arkansas, dropping through New York and then seeing the Ark. So quite an adventurous summer. Alrighty. We have one time for another question if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I'll shut this thing down. Yes. Oh, I didn't know if this was a hand going up or if it's one of those.
No,
charismatic-
just saying goodbye.
Oh, okay. All right.
I took a break from work for lunch, and I should get back.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
for,
you. I
coming
enjoyed
out.
it.
I
I was glad to
appreciate
be
you
able to
being here.
participate this time.
All right.
Well
Thank
done,
you so
Paul.
much.
Yes, thank you. Very good job.
Goodbye.